Hello, Crime Squad. Yes, it's that time of the week already. It's Friday, and I'm your host, Natasha, coming at you with another episode of Crime Squad Podcast. Thank you again for all your support. I cannot say it enough. If you're new here, welcome to Crime Squad, and if you've been listening all along, welcome back. I release bi weekly episodes on Fridays featuring Canadian true crime stories, both solved and unsolved. All right, let's get into it. Let's rewind back to the 1980s, specifically 1980. Songs like Rapper's Delight by the Sugar Hill Gang and Crazy Little Thing Called Love by Queen were topping Canadian music charts. The TV show Magnum PI was debuting as a television series, and believe it or not, the Canadian national anthem, O Canada, became official on July 1st, 1980. A lot went on this year. Terry Fox, a Canadian icon, started his Marathon of Hope run across Canada in support of cancer research in April of 1980. For any sports fans out there, Wayne Gretzky plays his first NHL game with the Edmonton Oilers. And for any Ryan Gosling fans, and who isn't a fan of that beautiful man, he was born on November 12th. On November 14th, 1980, the movie The Boogeyman was released in the United States. It was actually a box office hit, grossing $25 million internationally. One of the film's central themes is that people conspire to hide the truth. On November 17th, 1980, Christine Weller would unfortunately learn the Boogeyman was real. Squad, I do need to let you know this episode is going to contain details that will not be for everybody's ears. I will warn you when there will be descriptions of violence and tell you where to skip. But you should be warned, this episode is going to contain crimes against children. And as it was a very difficult case to research and write, I'm sure it will be a difficult one to listen to. Let's get into today's story. The Boogeyman. Does that bring back any childhood memories? We probably all have a story or two about this type of being. The Oxford Learner's Dictionary actually defines the Boogeyman as an imaginary or evil spirit that is used to frighten children. Fun fact, as I was researching this episode on June 2nd, 2023, I came across the fact that a movie called The Boogeyman was just released today in Canada, meaning June 2nd, based on the story The Boogeyman by Stephen King. Kind of a weird coincidence. But anyway, stories or warnings of the Boogeyman appear back as far as the 1500s. The central theme of this character, commonly depicted as male, is one who will punish children for misbehavior. Some stories depict a boogeyman that simply teaches a lesson without much damage, while others depict a violent being who steals children at night and physically harms them, sometimes killing them. What I find interesting is that there is a common entity referred or referenced in almost every single country or culture across the world. As we move from being children, our fear of abstract things such as the boogeyman hiding in the closet or the monster under the bed dissipate. In 1980s British Columbia, the idea of the boogeyman would become all too real, and the province lost child after child from 1980 to 1981. Surrey, British Columbia, November 17th, 1980. Christine Weller, who went by Chris, was a plucky 12-year-old girl, and she didn't want to go home. Home for Chris was a motel called the Bonanza, in a not-so-nice area of town just opposite the King George Highway. The motel consisted of 18 units, a lot of green clapboard, and cream stucco. Chris was tall and skinny. She had dark hair cut in a shaggy style with curtain bangs. Her face was angular with prominent eyebrows. She had small shaped eyes, blue in color, and a long, graceful neck. It was clear at the age of 12 she was going to grow into a beautiful young woman. She had the right attitude, happy go lucky, brave, and an edge that made her tough. Mother Rowley and Father Rick had moved into the motel in September of 1980 into Unit Number 2. Rick had been in the military, the Canadian military, as a chef for 18 years, but at the age of 47, he was finished with his service and had very few prospects to make a living. He had done a few other things, namely working at the BC Penitentiary as a cook for the inmates, and also a brief stint as a caretaker at nearby Mayfair Garden Apartments. Unfortunately, in a run of bad luck, the prison was deemed obsolete and closed down, and the low-income Mayfair Garden apartment complex had switched hands to a different management, so Rick was no longer required. Chris had seen a lot in her short time on Earth. The family had moved around a lot, as is typical with a military family. Chris was originally born in Quebec, but had lived in military bases across Canada. They had actually spent a lot of time in Inuvik, a town within the Northwest Territories. Now, Rick and Rolly were clearly going through some kind of depression. Their new favorite pastime was sitting in the motel, listening to the cold November rains pelt down as they watched TV. They were waiting for news of a job. News that wasn't coming. Chris's grandparents, Dot and Dan McConnell, worried about Rick and Rolly. They worried, too, about little Christine. They wanted Christine to live with them in Coquitlam. They had already taken in Chris's older brother and the family cat. They acted as a second set of parents for Chris, and Chris loved them dearly. But Chris had made the decision to stay with her parents. After all, it wasn't so bad. She had a lot of freedom because she wasn't really held accountable by either her mother or her father. And freedom for a 12-year-old was glorious. Chris did enjoy school, so she attended H.P. Matthew Elementary School regularly. She liked to go roller skating after school at the Stardust, a roller rink that opened in 1971. It has long since closed, shutting its doors in 2005. But it was a very popular spot back in the day, with a slow night bringing in about 600 people on average. And that's a slow night. There were lots of things for a young girl to do in Surrey. Swimming, biking, and if she needed extra cash and another reason to avoid going home to her parents, she could babysit for mothers in the motel. In November of 1980, Chris met a boy at school named Clive Walker. Clive and Chris were from what seemed to be two different worlds. Clive lived in a large home, and it was clean and detached, unlike the motel. Clive was popular with the girls, a handsome blonde kid. Clive had a new bike, something Christine could only dream of having. It was a $125 shiny red 10-speed bike. In just 10 short days, Chris and Clive became thick as thieves. In Clive, Chris found someone she could confide in. She told him about her father and how angry he got. How it was better if Chris stayed out of his way. Where Clive was shy, Chris was tough and more worldly. She shocked Clive when she bragged about how she'd stolen a pair of Nike shoes from someone's locker at the Stardust, and how she'd shoplifted a pair of designer jeans from the mall. And what better place to be than the mall? The mall was filled with kids of all ages, video games were becoming quite popular also, and all kinds of clothes, the clothes Chris wished she could wear. On November 17th, Chris and Clive decided to go to the mall to see what was going on. They stayed for about an hour, chatting with other kids and walking around. Not wanting to be late for supper, with both of them having a strict rule to be home by 5 p.m., they rushed back to Clive's house to retrieve their bikes. Chris realized then that hers had a flat tire, and she'd never make it home in time. And this would, of course, invite the wrath of her father, Rick. Chris did what she thought was the right thing. She asked her friend if she could borrow his bike. She pleaded with him that it would be just this one time. Clive, always a sweet kid, told Chris she could borrow it, but he wanted it back the next day. He made Chris promise she would drop it off on her way to school and to be very, very careful with the bike. If his father found out anything had happened to that bike, he would be angry. Chris assured her friend that nothing would happen. After all, it was only a 3-minute ride to the motel, and it was all downhill. She'd make it in no time. If only Chris could keep the promise she made, that nothing would happen. 3 days later, on November 20th, Clive's father, Alex, returned from a gambling trip in Nevada. He quickly found out his son had taken a gamble as well, having lent his bike to Christine Weller. Christine hadn't shown up for school since Clive lent her the bike, and she certainly hadn't returned the bike. Alex immediately phoned the motel, and the manager said he hadn't seen Christine for a while. Alex had a bad feeling, call it a sixth sense, that something wasn't quite right. How does a child disappear and nobody seems to have any regard for their whereabouts? Alex went to the motel and knocked on suite number 2. Rolly, Chris's mother, answered the door. In an angry tone, he asked her if she knew where her daughter was. Rolly said she didn't, and that Christine hadn't been home in a while. She said she thought maybe Christine was staying with a friend who lived by the school. The problem was, Alex knew something was wrong with that statement, because Clive was the only friend Christine had that lived near the school, and she wasn't with them. Alex began questioning Rolly about when Chris might be coming home, and Rolly said she didn't know. She said they were going to call the police, but they forgot. She also said she'd never seen a red bike. I find this absolutely shocking, but I have to remember I only have small pieces of the puzzle. The information on Christine's last hours before she went missing is just from a single article. What I don't know is, was Rick an abusive man and this is why Rolly seems so unsure of herself? Was Rolly an alcoholic? Were there other issues that might prevent her parents from realizing that their daughter was missing? As much as I want to scream at them, what the fuck is wrong with you? This is your child and she hasn't been seen. I have to try and reel that in and not pass judgment. There are conflicting stories about what was going on in Christine's life at the time. In one instance, a book written by Peter Worthington, the account given is that Christine's father was an abusive alcoholic, and her mother often didn't live with the family. It's said that at the time, Christine's grandmother had moved into the motel to try to care for Chris along with Chris's father, so it's hard to say what source is the right one. The book also depicts Chris, although young and tough, as a bit of a bad girl who occasionally smoked cigarettes and marijuana, and drank alcohol. On the night of November 17th, after Chris arrived home, her parents had a fight, and Rick decided he was going to go to the local pub to drink some beer. Chris offered to accompany him, at least to the pub, as she wouldn't be allowed in as a minor, but she'd get the chance to ride Clive's bike, and she loved that bike. She rode alongside her father, then stayed in a nearby parking lot, riding in circles, enjoying her time, as kids do. It was here that her fate was sealed, because the Boogeyman saw her. The Boogeyman, having had a fight with his wife, who had left on foot, was driving around trying to find her. Instead, he found Christine Weller. This evil man pulled his car over and asked Chris if she wanted a ride. She agreed. The thing about Christine was she wanted attention. She was desperate for it and eager to please. The man knew what he was doing, as he'd had practice with grooming. He offered Christine the opportunity to make money, and lots of it. He asked her if she drank or smoked marijuana. She admitted she did, and then he proceeded and high. When Christine was lulled into a false sense of security with the drugs and alcohol, the man proceeded to sexually assault her. Trigger warning for you now, squad. The following segment contains descriptions of violence and murder and is not for everyone's ears. If you want to skip ahead to avoid this, skip ahead at the 1 minute. Skip ahead about 1 minute and 50 seconds. The man drove Christine around and repeatedly stopped to sexually assault her. She was barely coherent and kept asking what time it was because she would be in big trouble if she was late home. The man assured her it was still early, which seemed to calm Christine. She was so far gone she had no concept of time. It was then the man decided he was in too deep and he needed to end Christine's life. He removed the shoelaces from her shoes and tried to strangle her. For several minutes he held the laces tight, but her will was strong. He tried to strangle her 4 times without success. The shoelaces eventually broke. He decided again he was aroused and he sexually assaulted her in a brutal and violent manner. Then he retrieved his 4-inch buck knife from his car, one from a set of 5 he'd gotten on sale at a local mall. He dragged Christine into the bushes and stabbed her multiple times. He pierced her heart twice and then slit her throat. He walked away after that, and he didn't feel a thing. The man drove Christine around and repeatedly stopped to sexually assault her. She was barely coherent and kept asking what time it was because she would be in big trouble if she was late home. The man assured her it was still early, which seemed to calm Christine. She was so far gone she had no concept of time. It was then the man decided he was in too deep and he needed to end Christine's life. He removed the shoelaces from her shoes and tried to strangle her. For several minutes he held the laces tight, but her will was strong. He tried to strangle her 4 times without success. The shoelaces eventually broke. He decided again he was aroused and he sexually assaulted her in a brutal and violent manner. Then he retrieved his 4-inch buck knife from his car, one from a set of 5 he'd gotten on sale at a local mall. He dragged Christine into the bushes and stabbed her multiple times. He pierced her heart twice and then slit her throat. He walked away after that, and he didn't feel a thing. It was on Christmas Day, 1980, that a man walking his dog near a scrubland by the Fraser River in Richmond, BC, found the nude and mutilated body of a 12-year-old girl. Richmond was Surrey's neighbor to the west. The girl was Christine Weller, and she had been stabbed 19 times. Of the gruesome discovery, Staff Sergeant John Kovaluk had this to say, quote, "It's a bad one." But they had no idea how bad it was going to get. Colleen Dagnall was a good girl. She grew up in the care of her father, Art, and his mother. She had a sister who was older than her by 2 years named Corinne. Colleen's mother was never really in the picture, and nobody could track her down because she was known for using different names. As a result of this, Art's mother, known as Granny to Colleen and her sister Corinne, took them in. Colleen, at the age of 13, was a shy and naive girl who didn't like to do a lot of partying, like some of the other kids her age. Colleen was studious as well. She was getting straight A's at school. She was said to be a little too trusting, though. The widely publicized photo of Colleen is black and white, so it's hard to imagine what her eye and hair color was. The photograph, though, to me, bears a striking resemblance to Christine Weller. Colleen looks fresh-faced and has a striking beauty to her. She has large, wide-set eyes, a medium-sized, slightly pointed nose, and a very toothy smile. Her face is oval in shape, and she has a head full of what appears to be thick, black or dark brown hair hitting mid-length down her neck. Apparently, Art Dagnall, Colleen's father, had quite the reputation in Delta, British Columbia. He had a few brothers, and they were known as a wild bunch who would get into trouble frequently. When Colleen was 10, her father remarried, bringing a woman named Dee Johnston into their lives. Dee had 6 sons, one of whom was named John and was 8 years old to Colleen's 10. Dee has fond memories of Corinne and Colleen and tells the Vancouver Sun in an article dated 20 years after Colleen went missing that she loved them both like her own daughters. John and Colleen found John and Colleen found solace in each other. The older kids didn't really want them around, so they spent time together instead. In 1981, Colleen's father, Art, and her stepmother, Dee, moved to Regina to be close to Dee's mother, who was in ill health. They allowed Colleen to stay in Surrey with Granny so she could finish out the school year. On Easter Monday, April 16th, 1981, Colleen was visiting her friend Sandra de Bruin, who lived in North Delta. It was a bus ride back to Surrey, and the later it got, Colleen realized she had to go home. She grabbed her skateboard, said goodbye to her friend, and walked toward a nearby service station. But the boogeyman was out and prowling, and he saw an opportunity served up on a silver platter. He pulled up to Colleen and started with the spiel he was using that seemed to be working every time he tried it. He asked Colleen if she knew where the employment office was, just like he later revealed he had asked Christine Weller. He said he was looking for some kids and he'd pay them $10 to wash windows for his construction company. He deftly handed Colleen one of the business cards he had made up, which he made specifically to be catchy and unique. He asked Colleen her name, and she obliged. He commented that it was late at night and she shouldn't be out, that she should be careful of strangers. He offered Colleen a ride home and also asked if she'd be interested in a job with him. Colleen said she'd need to ask her grandmother, but she did get in the car and she put her skateboard in the back seat. The boogeyman asked Colleen if she could grab him a beer, and she said she could have one too. Colleen, for whatever reason, perhaps because she didn't want to offend the well-meaning adult who offered her not only a ride home but also a job, said yes to the beer. The man also gave her 2 chloral hydrate pills, which was another part of his MO, and he would tell the children it would stop them from getting sick from the drink. In reality, though, chloral hydrate is a sedative. It's referred to on the street as knockout drops. Colleen wasn't doing well, and she passed out in the backseat of the car. The boogeyman drove toward Squamish, BC, down an old logging road that he assumed would offer him privacy. By this time, it was around 1 a.m. Colleen was not coherent and was seemingly unconscious. Squad, this is your warning that the next section will be graphic in nature and will contain descriptions of sexual assault and violence. It won't be for everybody. If you want to skip this section, move ahead by about 2 minutes, actually by 3 minutes. Colleen, being in a semi-conscious state, did not stop the man from violating her 3 times, which included sodomizing her twice. He had learned his lesson with Christine Weller. He didn't want to risk strangulation again because Christine had been so hard to actually kill that way. Instead, he had learned a new way to murder. He'd read somewhere that injecting someone's vein with air from a needle would kill them, and he wanted to try it. At some point, he'd stolen a hypodermic syringe from a doctor's office and he had it with him. He filled the needle with air 3 times, and 3 times he tried to inject the air into Colleen's arm. But nothing happened. He was pissed off and unsure of what to do. He dressed Colleen in her clothes, drove back to Surrey, and found an isolated area off the main road where he shut off his engine and fell asleep. He awoke early in the morning feeling very groggy, and Colleen was also awake but still extremely woozy and out of it from the night before. He asked her if she remembered anything, and she said she didn't. He raped her again. Colleen said she was worried about her granny, and the man assured Colleen he would get her home because she was his little sister. Colleen told him this isn't how brothers treat their sisters, but the man ignored that. He decided they would take a quick walk, and he told Colleen he'd have her home in 20 minutes. He told her to reach on top of one of the tree stumps that they walked by because there was a spare key there that he had hidden. And it was at that point he made a quick decision about how he was going to end things. Colleen, believing that she was going to be taken home, obeyed the man, and she reached up high on the stump, feeling around for the elusive key. Except there was no key. The man, who had brought a hammer with him, unbeknownst to Colleen, hit her full force on the back of the head. It was clear she wouldn't be getting back up again, and no further violence was necessary. Satisfied with himself, the man covered her body with branches and left the scene. It was 10 a.m. on Tuesday, April 17th, and he had places to be. He arrived at the local hospital about an hour later, where his wife was waiting for him. She'd just given birth to a newborn son, and they were preparing to go home with their new bundle of joy. Granny was worried. It was later in the evening on Monday, April 17th, she called her son Art in Regina and told him Colleen didn't come home from visiting a friend. Art called police in Delta, but according to D. Johnston, based on Art's past for being wild, as soon as police heard Colleen's last name, they said she was probably just out partying. But as we've already discussed here, Colleen wasn't the partying sort. A week went by with police in Delta doing nothing. Dee called the RCMP in Surrey, but they weren't made aware of a missing person. A week after that, the entire family was in a state of panic. This was not like Colleen at all, and they knew something happened. 3 months after Colleen's disappearance, the family was approached by an RCMP officer from Vancouver who flew to Regina to interview the family. Was Colleen in trouble and trying to make her way to Regina? Did she join a cult and go into the mountains? Did she have a boyfriend she ran away with? None of these questions made any sense to Dee and Art, but then they found out Colleen had simply been listed as a runaway. And despite the family's pleas, Colleen was listed this way for 6 months until the day they found her body. Colleen's body was located not because she was found by a passerby or the police, but because of the extremely controversial decision by the RCMP to pay the man who committed this murder $10,000 per victim if he revealed where he had left their bodies. Finding Colleen was the beginning of the end of the family. Corinne had flown home to be with Granny, and the RCMP took her, without permission, to identify Colleen's clothes she had been wearing the night she was murdered. Corinne was 15 years old, and she was never the same after this. It traumatized her. Granny would never be the same either, and she would pass away the following year. Art beat himself up constantly, telling himself if he had only have forced Colleen to go to Regina with them, she would still be alive. Drinking took over his life and spun him into a whirlwind of hurt. He lost his job. His relationship with Dee became strained. Art tried to go to a psychiatrist, and he was diagnosed as paranoid schizophrenic with multiple personality disorder, brought on by the traumatic event of Colleen's murder. It was 4 years later, in 1985, that Art, who was on a bender, was brought home by two men who claimed they found him in a ditch. He was extremely drunk, and it was 20 degrees below Celsius that night. They put Art to bed, and in the morning, Dee, who slept on the couch to give Art space to sleep off his drunken state, brought him a cup of coffee. Only she couldn't wake him. She called an ambulance, and 20 minutes later, she was told by the paramedics that it was too late. Art was dead. The official cause of death was alcohol poisoning. Corinne ended up in a foster home in British Columbia, and she later was adopted by a family in BC who treated her well. She went on to have two children with two separate fathers, unfortunately both of whom were abusive. Dee, who provided most of the story to the Vancouver Sun, says she has since lost touch with Corinne but wishes she could find her to continue a relationship. In all the years that Colleen hasn't been part of this earthly realm, she is fondly missed and remembered, and Dee knows that she's with her father now, looking down on those who are still alive. Less than a week after Colleen didn't come home, Darren Johnsrud didn't either. It was April 21st, 1981, at around 11:30 a.m. that Darren went to a corner store in Coquitlam, BC to buy cigarettes. He was visiting from Saskatoon, where he lived with his father. It was his mother Sharon and her husband Gary Rosenfeld that lived in Coquitlam, and Darren decided to spend Easter break with them. Darren was 16 years old and was going through a little bit of a rebellious phase. He was known to be moody, but also pretty cocky. He wasn't very tall at 5'5" and weighing only about 120 pounds, but he was certainly ready for an argument, usually for no apparent reason, like most kids his age. Notably, he and his stepfather Gary had a difficult relationship. The picture I'll post of Darren shows a boy who looks younger than 16. If he were in a boy band, he'd probably be labeled the heartthrob. He has straight hair that is longish and lightly curtains his prominent almond-shaped eyes. His eyebrows are thick and frame his face perfectly, giving his face a lot of character. His face is oval and thin, and his nose is slightly upturned, showing the black of his nostrils. His lips are wide but thin, specifically his top lip. All in all, though, he appears to be a very handsome boy, with a little bit of a hard glint to his expression. On April 21st, the Boogeyman was hungry again. He had just taken the life of Colleen on April 17th, but he still wanted more. The man pulled up in his car, his typical MO, and approached Darren. It wasn't hard at all to get Darren into the car once the man produced a bottle of beer and offered Darren a job. The same job he always offered: $10 an hour to wash windows for his construction company. The man began to drive to Mission, BC, until he reached a very small community called Desroches. It was here that the Boogeyman decided it was time to get what he really wanted from Darren. Darren had no idea what was even coming. The man had fed him beers and those small green pills, which of course were the same pills he'd given to both Colleen and Christine. Chloral hydrate, a powerful sedative. By this point, Darren was only semi-conscious, and the man violated him repeatedly. He did not seem to comprehend what was happening. Darren didn't. Squad, as I'm sure you know by now, Darren wouldn't be leaving that deserted road in Desroches. Using a hammer, maybe the same one he'd used to end Colleen's life, the man would end Darren's. He would leave Darren where he lay, and he would throw Darren's clothes and the hammer into the nearby Fraser River. He made the long drive back to Surrey, where he cleaned and vacuumed out his car, then was later pulled over for impaired driving in Vancouver. Police were so close, but so far away. Meanwhile, Darren's mother became worried when he didn't return from the store. He was supposed to be meeting his aunt and cousin for a visit, which everyone was excited about. Darren was only staying in BC for 2 weeks, so they wanted to make the most of their time together. After searching the neighborhood for the better part of the day, the police were called around 6 p.m. that evening. And like the alarming trend we're seeing here, police shrugged off the disappearance and suggested Darren was a runaway. It wasn't taken seriously at all. Darren was found on May 2nd, but the body was in such a state that he couldn't be identified. It wasn't until 5 days later, through dental records, that confirmation would be made that it was in fact Darren, and that he had in fact been the victim of foul play. And still, the Boogeyman would run rampant in BC. On May 19th, a young hitchhiker would make a decision that would forever alter her life. But that wouldn't be the last of the Boogeyman. Not by a long shot. Well, squad, I think I'll end there for now. This is going to conclude part 1 of The Boogeyman is Real. Be sure to tune in to the next episode, released in 2 weeks on Friday. As always, thank you for joining me. If you like the way I write and tell these stories, or if Canadian true crime is your jam, be sure to subscribe to Crime Squad Podcast. You can listen wherever you get your podcasts. You can also rate, that would be very appreciated. If you have an idea for a story or a case you want me to cover, flip me an email at crimesquadpodcast@gmail.com or send me a direct message through my Instagram at crimesquadpod. All right, we're going to end for today. And again, thank you so much. And remember, stay safe and be kind to each other.